Kevin, looks like you're by yourself tonight. Your partners haven't come in yet. But let's go ahead and start with Hinduism. Get us a little bit of introduction tonight. And next week we'll finish it up. With Hinduism, we enter a whole new world from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. On the popular level, Islam shares some elements that we'll see here in Hinduism, but by and large, there is a significant difference, and even where there are similarities, which the text made numerous references to, there are some significant underlying differences. The name, as best we guess, comes from the world of India, the Indus River Valley, the Sanskrit name for the river. Drop the S, you get the basis for Hinduism. The word apparently was applied by the Muslims when they reached that part of the world. In its origins, it's the oldest religion in terms of what we can trace in any meaningful way. It is also the most internally diverse. The differences that in Christianity, in Judaism, in are even more numerous and more different in Hinduism. It grows up out of a fusion of indigenous peoples in the area of India and an Indo-European immigrant that comes in the middle of the second millennium BC. Sometime around 1750 to 1200. If you take the later date, 1200, you're dealing with the common popular time for the Hebrews leaving Egypt and going to Palestine. These people are distinctively different, both in terms of language and custom, and they come in as often immigrants in the ancient world came in as a kind of a ruling class and aristocracy that gradually melds into the population that's there. Religiously, what comes out of this era grows out of the polytheism, the animistic understanding that not just people, but things are inhabited by spirit beings of some kind, of which there are a multitude because every small group of people had their own version of this. And then around 1000, there begins to appear a clear priestly class and the religion that they support. Ceremonies, animal sacrifices, especially in their case, horses, which is interesting. The numbers that you see here on the material refer to the literature that we're going to look at next. So number 2 and 3 of A will be the literature that we'll see under A, 2 and 3 when we get down a little bit lower. It's among this group, priests being at the top, that we have a fourfold caste system begin to form, which is pretty strong. The priests are on top, the warriors are second, then comes the business, and then comes everybody else. Beginning around 800, this religious amalgamation that's emerging gains significant philosophical input. People who weren't priests develop ideas about the god, about how to approach the god, about the meaning of the ceremonies, and that kind of thing. There's some similarities, enough that some people think that these philosophical features that come in could possibly be related to Zoroastrianism, which is arising in Iran at about the same time. The philosophical vantage point takes on significant mystical elements, whether that grows out of it or simply is joined with it from entirely different sources, nobody knows. And you get this group of literature we're going to talk about, the Upanishads, that begin to have some reaction against this Brahmin priestly leadership, which, as often in cultures, is a closed group because of their status as the leaders of the religion. They have significant control and everything's to their advantage. It's at this time that now with this philosophical input, we get a way of knowledge developing as a meaningful approach to deal with this kind of stuff. And we get this firm development of a deity generally referred to as Brahman, and the spiritual inner core of human beings, most commonly called among them the Atman, who is, and there you get all kinds of variations as to what the relationship between these two is, to what degree is Brahman even personal, and to what degree is Atman distinctly individual, or is he or she just some spin-off manifestation aspect element of the Brahman. And this we're going to see is the fundamental underlying belief of Hinduism that varies so significantly from those that we've looked at. In 550 before Christ, we get a organized opposition to the priesthood, its exclusive right to the sacrifices, and sacrifices as effective elements are replaced with an asceticism and the Jains emerge as a separate religious movement, but significantly within the overarching framework of Hinduism. And about the same time, you get the reform against many elements of the priestly Hinduism by Buddha, and Buddhism develops. Many of the Hindu persuasion are perfectly willing to see Buddhism as simply a subsect of Hinduism. In a couple hundred years later, we get the arrival or the arising within Hinduism of a more devotional emphasis. And those of you that have done some reading in the book can see here his two yogas, the yoga of knowledge and the yoga of emotion, or the yoga of love. It's finally physical buildings, real temples begin to emerge, religious centers. There is an emerging loyalties to various of the gods. But notice the names that arise here: Vishnu, Shiva, and Shakti. We'll see momentarily have slightly different status. It's at this time that the formal yogas are being seen, where there are clear proponents of one process or another of pursuing this religious life in a very serious way. At the same time, you now get the arrival of formal legalistic material. There is now the attempt to regulate more than just the religious aspect or activities, which has previously, of course, been under the Brahmins, the priests. As these things develop, you get clear evidence of distinct groups. In the 9th century of this era, you get a reformer, Tiruvallur, who really makes the animal sacrifice more and more foreign to Hinduism, to the point that nowadays animal sacrifice is almost unheard of in Hinduism. The cow that was earlier a sacrifice animal now becomes sacred, and you just absolutely do not sacrifice this animal. And you see this doesn't arise until the 9th century, this era. In the 11th century, there is a more strong movement of the idea of a real personal God. And in your reading, you've seen that this is a surprising difference in Hinduism. In the 12th century, you get an attempt to reform the caste movement to the point that they actually become really anti-caste. In the 14th and 15th century, you get an attempt to eliminate the caste system, doesn't succeed, and significantly introduced into Hinduism a grace element that significantly acts in contrast, even opposition to the four yogas, the four formal yogas, all of which you see your development spiritually are all contingent upon your success in accomplishing these elements. And Ramananda finds within the tradition, within its books, elements that say there actually is a way to just accept the blessing of the God and live with it. There is a further attempt at elevating one God or another to the point of a genuine monotheism. And the one thing I keep forgetting to look up is which God this guy focused on. So maybe one of you send me an email this week and remind me I need to finally pursue that and see who he settled on. He also began a serious effort to oppose the burning of the widow, which now is outlawed, even though, of course, it still happens. But that's a modern development. In the mid-19th century, you get what became an underlying element for expansion into the Western world with Ramakrishna, who is non-dualist, which means they don't believe there is two elements, i.e. spirit and material. You either have the material, modern scientific materialism, or you have spirit. And everything you think is one is not that, is really is, but you've just been misled. And this is the element of Hinduism in the 1800s that first comes to the Western world. And you get it in the American experience in transcendentalism. Those people were readers of some of Hinduism. Okay, that's the flyover of 3,000 worth of history. Now we look at the fundamental document. The foundation literature of this first era is called the oral tradition, the heard material, even though it obviously got written down. There are 4 Vedas, they call them in this. They're all written in a language that's really a precursor to Sanskrit, which means the vast majority of Hindus, even significant followers of Hinduism, serious participants in any one of the yogas, may not be able to read any of the Vedas. One of the Vedas is composed mainly of hymns. And those people who've studied them see that there's at least 76 gods praised in the hymns in this collection of literature. One of these Vedas is a collection of the sacrifice rites. One of them is a collection of the priestly chants for the sacrifices. And then one of them is broader in terms of looking at daily life, although it doesn't go into great detail, but that means that there are going to be certain activities in daily life experience that are going to be highlighted and have rituals, rites, prayers, that kind of thing around. This is the oldest fundamental material. Within that material, there are four kinds of literature, so to speak. We mentioned the hymns. The Ramanas are mostly prose, and they're the myths and the legends and the, what's the other word? Oh, shoot. About people. Yeah, but there's one of the literature words is used for that. It's in this material that you get your first ideas of this transmigration or reincarnation that we'll look at. There's a mystical treaties, ascetic documents, and we're not talking about long works here, little essays, that kind of thing. And then you finally get this emerging group of philosophical materials, the Upanishads, which probably figure far more heavily in subsequent Hinduism than any of the other stuff. Then they have a secondary set of material that arises and is held in authoritative status in varying degrees. And this material is the remembered material. The other stuff was the things they heard. This was given by the gods. This is the material that those earliest people remembered. And there are several sutras in this manual on religious life, but then there's another manual on the cultic rituals. There's a manual that deals with the calendars and mathematics. There's a fascinating section of this that deals with Pythagorean theory, complete with drawings, the whole bit. And then there are the Dharma Sutras, which have to do with larger life, formal life of the individual, of the home, of the community, of the societies, social organization. It's this kind of thing. And it's in this literature that this 4 stages of life emerges in a formal way. The student, the householder, and the spiritual man. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Then there's a second set of material that elaborates on these materials, some of them. The most important one is the Law of Manu. This has all kinds of social standards, ethical standards, and this is the one in which this caste system first shows up in a very formal way. And you have the priest, the ruler, the strong arm, the artisan, merchant, farmer, and the manual laborer. Then you get the epics, that's the word I was looking for, and the mythologies. The most important one is this first one, Mahabharata, that contains the Davita, which is probably the most well-known piece of literature from Hinduism in this country. And it's the story of two great clans. You get it it's a warrior, Arjuna, and his charioteer, who really turns out to be Krishna. And we'll look at this chain of deity issues. Who Krishna is really an incarnation of Vishnu in one of them. Ramanya is another famous person about whom an epic is written. And then we get these pranas. I don't know why they drop the U, but they do. Which are non-priestly, but the myths contain a great deal of ritual. Some of which are available even to this lowest class of people. And this material is probably the most popular, although they don't refer to the material, it's stuff that comes out of this that seems to be the major common religious practice of the day. Then you have more epics and legends. You have the mystical texts. You have the yogic material, and you even have some Buddhist material that is still retained by the Hindus. So as you can see, you have a vast literature. And all of this has commentaries and expansions in, since at least the 1500s. This material has just been exploded. People writing on one aspect or another of one of these materials or another. This is especially true with the devotional material and the philosophical texts, because within the philosophical community, now within Hinduism, there are at least 6 major schools, probably more. I don't know that there's any point except you're having this to, if you ever wanted to look it up, you can go back and look at it to some degree. And then there's this whole development of this feminist pantheon, the tantric works. Number 8 of additional literature. And thus you have a wide variety of literature, from the most religious, cultic, ceremonial, to the most theoretical, philosophical. And one would not be surprised then that you have highly diversified religious life experience that grows out of this. And the full range of to what degree is the individual more central, the community more central, all that kind of thing. Looking at several different sources, there seemed to be a consensus that in Hinduism, you might be considered non-Hindu if you completely, totally rejected the Vedas. Now, you might have located one minor, almost contradictory element in the Veda that you have locked on, but as long as you are willing to call your source the Veda, however strange you have interpreted it in order to arrive at where you are, you could still be considered an Hindu. But if you just totally reject this material, well, they're all wet, and you try to go back and start over with some other totally different approach, then you wouldn't really be a Hindu. Surprisingly enough, there still seems to be a really strong acceptance of the caste system, even though it's legally outlawed. And even though there are elements of Hinduism that are almost totally non-deity philosophical, if they're grounded historically in Hinduism, they get to stay. But you can't come to Hinduism with a total disrespect for their veneration of their deity or deities. Now, you will notice in Smith, in his discussions, there is strong emphasis over one deity. That the polytheism is simply our human attempts to represent all of the aspects, features, elements of the deity. And we don't really believe in many gods. We only believe in one God. And he has a discussion about that several times. And in one of the discussions, he points out that Hinduism has, from his vantage point, developed the freedom, but the emphasis that everybody should, in their religious life, focus on one single element, feature, characteristic of deity, so that they're an adherent of this God, that God, the other God, whom they know by name and whose image they may revere in some way or another. But his emphasis, Smith's emphasis, is that at the base, there is the clear understanding that there's only one spirit, generally referred to as Brahman. And all the rest of this is simply human attempts to understand, to relate to him, to it, in some way. And thus you have this quote about its variety and therefore its tolerance. Now, those of you that are familiar with current events in Hindu know that this tolerance is tolerable only within Hinduism. It can't tolerate Christians. It can't tolerate Islam. And currently in India, there are in several places very strong Hindu nationalist movements that have become quite oppressive, even persecuting. But those being persecuted are totally outside the community of Hindu. Okay, we'll take the rest of this evening, I think, to look at this. This is the major gods of the Vedic literature. The Indra is the supreme god of ancient Hinduism. He's been totally almost displaced by now. He is the ruler of heaven. Agni was the god of fire, thus the god of the priesthood and sacrifice. Varuna was the god of the universe. Vishnu will reemerge out of these gods in a very, very significant way. Now, what's fascinating, you see, is that while Indra is the chief god, Prajapati is the creator god. In their old pantheon, but Prajapati was the creator god. That's number 7 on your list. As I mentioned before, especially with the Upanishads, there is the emergence of a clear monotheism, an eternal, infinite, unknowable, singular reality. And in some of them, that's all there is. Everything else is illusion. Everything else is imagination. There is no thing. There is no material. We humans, and Smith has a long discussion about our 4-part makeup: body, mind, rational mind, subconscious mind, and then the Atman, the real me, the real self, capital S. And as I mentioned before, there is a wide variety within Hinduism of how individual and distinct this Atman is. And therefore, what the status and the destiny of the Atman is. But the fundamental underlying anthropology of Hinduism is like the Greeks. Human beings are fundamentally spirit. To what degree that is individual, particularly within Hinduism, is debated or disagreed upon. And our material being is totally secondary. And the mental aspect of our being is the conjunction of those two elements. But that consciousness and that subconsciousness are still fundamentally a part of this Atman, although they are distant enough with him that when we get to those yogas, you see that there is a very clear distinction between this core self and the person self that you see yourself and you experience yourself, you're conscious of yourself, and certainly others are conscious of you. They see a real distinction break between them, even though, of course, they're completely integrated. And it depends then on to what degree you envision this one singular reality to be personality or void of personality. And Hinduism has both. There are those in which this, to whom this is simply a spiritual force, a non-material energy. And there are those who perceive this Brahman as spiritual energy. These images of the deities, they often are portrayed in a variety of ways in order to portray various aspects of reality. Shiva is one of the very popular gods, for whom there are probably thousands of images. Shiva is often portrayed with 7 faces or 8 arms or 3 sides in order to communicate perceived elements that they are emphasizing. Humans have 5 senses, for instance. The Hindus believe there are 5 parts to our body, and thus the god would have 5 faces. The primary elements of the universe that they perceive as 5-fold. In some of their mythologies, they emphasize 8 primary elements: the wood, the water, the fire, and the air, the sun and the moon, food, medicine, and God. Why they chose those, I don't know. The 3 eternal principles of deity were up here. He's eternal. They're not either here. He's eternal, he's omnipotent, and he's unseeable. He's invisible. In the classic Hinduism, the deity, the Brahman, the spiritual force has developed, created multiple worlds. And you can envision them in any manner that fits your imagination. Horizontal, vertical. Some of them are permanent, some of them are temporary, but they're all there. And this spiritual reality, this force is permanent, eternal. And we're in this reality that was created or simply exists because that's the way things are. But we're here provisionally. Not only is it here that way, but we're here that way. And this reality has not just with physical parts, spiritual parts, absolute moral quality or character. And this gets defined in a whole variety of ways. And we're here to get back to where we came from, is the easiest way to describe it. Because there isn't a clear, coherent view of why we're here. Why do these Atmans, why are these Atmans embodied? What's behind them? What's the purpose or the end point of that? This reality, if it's real, remember there are those Hindus who believe it's not real, it's all illusion. It's all perception. When they see humans here having to cope with this reality and learn how to survive within it and somehow permanently escape it, there is not an origin story for that. We're here. We got to figure out what is. And so far, we figured this out. Or with the Vedas, the deity, and of course, see, when the Vedas were written, there were still gods. So it wasn't just the deity, it was the gods who told us this, who gave us this information. But when you go back to the Vedas, you don't have the kind of information that explains why we're here. It's just we're here. And this is the structure of the reality. And somehow we have to learn how to cope with it, survive in it, given the fact that what we do is going to have consequences. And until we achieve some significant identity, unity with this reality, this God, this spirit, this force, we're going to keep coming back. When you die, the body that your Atman is in dies, but the Atman doesn't. The Atman comes back as something else. And what it comes back in is controlled by what kind of life it's lived. But now remember, you see, the life it just died from isn't the only life it's lived. And therefore, your ability to affect how you're going to come back is significantly constrained because there's a whole lot of the karma that you have that you didn't create, and you can't create, and you can't change. It's already there from the other times that you were born into this reality and left it. And within Hinduism, and this is how Smith introduces it, we are caught up in this endless cycle. He doesn't mention that. He starts with simply our current experience, wherein our three deepest desires are always thwarted. Our desire for infinite joy, which is crushed by pain and frustration and boredom. Our desire for infinite knowledge, which is thwarted by all kinds of limits to our minds and even our language. And then this infinite being, to be. To exist, which of course is limited because we're in a physical body that's going to die. And therefore this spark of eternity, remember the writer of Proverbs talks about that, seems to be, to the Hindus, a real quality of our being. We just can't seem to deny it, suppress it, avoid it, control it. But we can't accomplish it because we're going to die. All kinds of things we'd like to know, we can't. All kinds of joy we would like to have. We get little spurts of it here and there, but nothing that lasts. So how do we make the best out of the situation? And Hinduism is the attempt of those people of that subcontinent to accomplish that. Okay, let me stop here and see what questions you want to pursue. Anybody want to look at one of these issues or another? There should have been a paragraph, a counterpart to this, that I just now realized isn't here. Because the pantheon of Hinduism, in terms of 6 or 8 prominent ones, has significantly changed. Of these, Vishnu is the only one that has any popular support, adherence in modern Hinduism. Krishna has greatly displaced many of those. And I thought that obviously something got dropped from my, and I didn't catch it. I got to go back and look that up for you.
Well, I'm only a few pages into the chapter, so maybe it's covered in the book, but most, say for example, the 1 through 7 is God, or the one that has been mentioned
Yes.
before. So they have total liberty to believe in any of these gods and laws.
Yes. Yeah. Which, in Smith's view, which image, which manifestation of God you believe is immaterial? Because you really need to have one singular attachment to God in one of his faces, in one of his elements. Otherwise, you could drift off without any real connection. But in their acceptance of each other, because they grew up with this multitude of gods, and it really is prolific, because you see, you not only have these 7 gods of the Vedas, which were the gods of prominence when those books, that material was produced. You have, as Hinduism spread over the continent, because it starts with this view that either there are many gods, which is fine because that's reality, or they're all just manifestation of the same God. That means when Hinduism goes to a totally new area, the people there don't have to change their gods. All they have to do is put their gods into the pantheon. Would depend on precisely what that particular temple was interested in promoting, as to whether there's only one or whether they might have numerous ones in the same room or in different rooms. And that totally depends on the locality, which means in certain localities, you see, you're going to have a god that you've never seen anywhere else in India, because this was the god of that ethnic and tribal group way back 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and they simply included their god in the pantheon as they adopted whatever parts of Hinduism that was being introduced to them, whatever was meaningful to them, they would incorporate. What wasn't, they didn't. And thus, all of the rituals, the practices, the prayers, the incantations, the magic, all of those elements, very, very widely all over the continent, because there was never a sense that any of these is, quote, wrong. There was no need to displace anything. You just incorporate.
And you said, that one quote, it's that says they accept all.
Yeah, well, that, yeah.
That also, which group we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as I mentioned, you see, there are now strong Hindu nationalists in India who aren't that way at all. And so there now in certain parts of the country are regular attacks made on churches, Christian groups, Muslim groups, temples, church buildings, imams, pastors are with way too commonality killed, badly beaten up, buildings burned, torn down. So the aristocratic, the academic, the ecumenical Hindus are perfectly open to multi-faith activities in this country. They would be insulted if we had a spirit emphasis day in the city of Houston and one of their representatives was not invited to be on the platform with the mayor, with an imam and a rabbi and a pastor. They would not, that would just not be acceptable at all. Because they're accepting us, we should be accepting them. And within Hinduism, of course, they have that acceptance of all their variations. And there again depends on what the particular spirit of that particular group is. You would have groups, for instance, who still strongly support, enforce the caste system. And fundamentalists, you would have some who are more liberal with respect to that. And certainly since it's been technically outlawed legally, would not make open opposition and efforts. They might internally, if you married somebody out of your caste system, you might get thrown out of the church, thrown out of the temple, thrown out of your family group or whatever, because you crossed the line, but they're not going to make that a court case, and that kind of thing. Whereas there are those still who would make sure that you didn't live very long. You have those aspects of Hinduism that are thoroughly westernized from the standpoint of there are elements that are clearly, quote, liberal in the view that they see this almost in a most postmodern way, that this is simply the moral, religious elements that grew up in this country at this time in this place, and they have no more validity, value, significance than those in any other place. And there is a very real difference between the Hinduism that you will find described in Smith's book and the Hinduism that you would find in the average Hindu village, where it is much more a popular religious practice, where there would be sacrifices, not, of course, in hardly any cases, animal sacrifices, even though that's where they started. All kinds of magic, all kinds of healing, spirit people of various capacities and capabilities, priests, if the village was big enough to have a temple of some kind, and what is there would depend entirely on whether this has been brought to these people or this is indigenous to this community. And so you would have a vast difference. I'm sure there are some people in India who, if they could read Smith's book, would say, and that's not Hinduism. That's not the Hinduism I know. Just like you would have with some Christians who would read a book on theology written by another Christian, and it would say, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's not the God I know. He's not like that at all. But within itself, Hinduism can tolerate this whole thing. Yeah, fundamentally. Except even less in terms of the distinction. I mean, the distinction is even less important. Whether you're a Baptist or a Methodist in modern America really doesn't mean a whole lot. 100 years ago, it could make a big difference. Nowadays, it doesn't. And for the Hindu, yes, that's pretty comparable. Although I would say they're even more that way. But as I said, again, that depends on the particular group you're dealing with as to how ecumenical they feel. Let me make one other point about Hinduism, particularly in contrast to the book. Major part of Hinduism in the text deals with the four paths of Hinduism. The way of knowledge, the way of love, the way of work, and the way of psychophysical exercise, which is the stereotypical. We'll look at those next week, but I want you to remember, and you can see it when you look at these, each one of these four is a very rigorous discipline. To be serious about any one of these, to begin to achieve, remember, what you're trying to do is figure out a way to escape this endless cycle of reincarnations. You want to escape the experience of being thwarted in your deepest desires for joy and knowledge and being. What you want to do is achieve infinite being. What you want to know is everything you really need to know in order to have infinite being and infinite joy. And that means that in some way, your Atman has to grow, transform itself, be changed to such a degree that it significantly matches Brahman. That it can achieve a close enough relationship with Brahman, if you perceive him as personal, that he wants to keep you with himself, where you can enjoy infinite being, infinite joy with infinite knowledge. Or if Brahman is just a force, a spiritual reality, you become so close to him, that you become inseparable from him. Now, given the fact that this world is thwarting your efforts. In order to get past all of these negative forces that are thwarting you, it's going to take a great deal of focus, work, concentration, effort. To so divest your Atman of all of the misinformation and the error and the untruth that you believe, that you will not any longer be held back by your ignorance, by your wrong thinking. And how much have you been able to change intellectually? How much have you been able to alter the way you think? How much have you been able to change your moral character? To achieve the end result, it's going to be difficult, which means that the four ways are only going to be the destiny of a minority of people. Most of us, vast majority of us, are never going to get there. We're never going to be able to purify our love, cleanse our minds, to get past all the ways this creation thwarts our deepest desires. So what you have is to a great extent, a religion of the monks. Of the monks. Yeah, of the monks, of the profession. The people who have the ability, mental, physical, time, money, energy, or simply the commitment to do it and stick with it for as long as it takes, and succeed before they die. For the vast majority of us folk, our Hindu faith can't pursue any of those four. And that's why you had that grace reform. You had a Hindu who realized this doesn't work for ordinary people.
So are they on a never-ending cycle?
Yes, they're on a never-ending cycle. Yeah. No, this will never come to an end. And the only way it can end, you see, is if you get past these obstacles and get close enough, understand well enough, relate to deeply enough, consistently enough, that Brahman either keeps you or absorbs you, that you become Brahman. And until you can do that, it won't work. And you see, that's what produces Buddhism. Buddha tries all of this, and he's not succeeding. And so an absolute, abject depression. He goes into a trauma, into a trance, where he finally figures out what the real truth is, which is different. But you see, he still is within this whole framework. He's still trying to accomplish the same thing because of the same underlying reality. He just has a fifth way.
The Buddha started off.
Yeah, he was a Hindu. He was trying to follow one of these paths, and he wasn't succeeding. And fortunately for him, Brahman broke through and gave him the enlightenment. Okay. Next week, we'll look at how they see this, both in terms of their attempts to do something with it. You have this whole sheet, so you can see some of this stuff at the end that I've mentioned today about the regional varieties and that kind of thing. Is that where I had mine? No, I didn't. I still got to go back and find where that modern pantheon is. Okay, see you next week.
Thank you. Have a wonderful week.
You too.
Well, did you enjoy watching extras? I did, but I was working while so I ended up working more than I used to come up with. I took my computer to the living room, so I watched the game, and my husband was all of it. I lost track of time, and I ended up working longer than I used to. Although I was sleep a little bit, you know, I didn't have memories of my figures. Yeah, I just have to run. But it's good. Because it's work. Well, yeah, I was trying to, he was trying to get it into the night and do some other stuff, and I was trying to keep the sounds from them to turn off. So he would bother me, but of course, you know, things would happen and like, no, yes. Yeah, maybe you gotta watch this. Well, I think either like if you had working on there, you would be able to get on those little boxes, but you, as long as you just exit, like you move that screen and you hit the red. And
Here's what I'm looking for. It had gotten covered up and I couldn't find it.
so anyway.